I'm one of the co-founders of EV3. We're trying to expand the aperture of the crypto economy. There was this really common pattern that we kept seeing in industries where over the past 10, 20, 30 years, the actual cost of hardware had pretty much gone to zero. We can now produce wireless routers and computer chips and cameras, literally 1,000 or 10,000 times cheaper than we could decades ago. But what we noticed was that the price reductions didn't make their way into the hands of consumers. And so we kept seeing this dynamic where the actual cost to produce a very core good like energy or bandwidth or compute was basically approaching zero. Crypto is always the most powerful coordination mechanism that humanity's ever known. We've already deflated the hardware costs in these industries. What does it take to deflate the coordination costs? And that's really DePIN. It's the fact that you can coordinate these networks in a way that's much, much more efficient. And that means that you can now go and provide whatever the network does to customers way, way cheaper than what traditional industries do.
What industry dynamics are required for a DePIN to thrive?
The answer is that
Salvador, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, man. I'm doing great. How are you?
Very, very well, thanks. I think it's definitely worth mentioning that you were one of the speakers at our event in Dubai quite a long time ago, the We Are DePIN first ever event we did in Dubai. And that was where the podcast was actually born from. So it feels right to have you on the podcast again after you released the 2024 Missouri reports, and you were kind enough to obviously include us in there, which is amazing. First question I really wanted to ask you, Salvador, is what got you into DePIN? What do you like about DePIN the most?
Yeah, it's a lot of ways to answer that. Well, to give some context, maybe for folks that don't know what EV3 is, I'm one of the co-founders of EV3. We're a venture fund that has been investing behind DePIN for a little bit over, or just about 3 years now. The way we think about investing is that we're trying to expand the aperture of the crypto economy. And for us, that means that we're always willing to squint a little bit harder than other investors to imagine what kind of use cases crypto can enable and where in the real economy crypto is going to make a real impact. And the first use case that both my co-founder and I really, captured our imagination and attention and focus in a way that only Bitcoin had done for me in the past was helium in early 2020. And we both became just went as far deep as we could in this community, and both helping to deploy miners, in getting involved with the team, in analyzing the tokenomics and providing, helping the market understand the valuation parameters and what they were trying to build. And what we noticed was that, one, we kept seeing, as we met more early stage founders who were in and around helium or other Filecoin and other types of ecosystems, there was this really common pattern that we kept seeing in industries where over the past 10, 20, 30 years, the actual cost of hardware, or the cost of doing whatever these companies do, had pretty much gone to zero, both because of technology advancements and Moore's law and massive fucking supply chain scaling. We can now produce wireless routers and computer chips and cameras, literally 1,000 or 10,000 times cheaper than we could decades ago. But what we noticed was that those prices didn't actually make their way, or the price reductions didn't make their way into the hands of consumers, right? You actually what all the coordination costs associated with getting that hardware out there and getting it to talk to each other and coordinating jobs between it actually got more expensive because salaries inflate and people were getting, the administrative state took over these companies. And so we kept seeing this dynamic where the actual cost to produce a very core good like energy or bandwidth or compute was basically approaching zero, but the coordination costs that were basically the entire cost structure, or the majority of the cost structure in these companies. And for us, crypto is always the most powerful coordination mechanism that humanity's ever known. That's how we think about it. And so we imagined that, now we've already deflated the hardware costs in these industries. What does it take to deflate the coordination costs? And that's really DePIN. It's the fact that you can coordinate these networks in a way that's much, much more efficient. And that means that you can now go and provide whatever the network does to customers way, way cheaper than what traditional industries do. And the traditional industries just simply can't operate at those levels. They have structural reasons why they cannot price that low. And that always gets us very excited as early stage investors, because there's this potential to become maybe a new player in these industries that capture trillions of dollars of revenues globally every year. And so that's the reason. For me, also from a more philosophical perspective, and being deeply, I guess, in the crypto libertarian camp of the industry, it doesn't make sense to have a world computer if you don't have permissionless access to the end. You can't access that computer in a permissionless way. you can't actually go and use blockchains. And we see this threat vector actually play out in practice in emerging markets where governments are not as strong, like in Venezuela. It's like the first thing the government does is send guys with militaries to the ISPs and the cable companies and start controlling the media. And so in practice, like a blockchain having Ethereum doesn't help people that much or other chains if they can't actually access it. And so that's how we got started down this decentralized wireless internet path, and expanded from there into a lot of other areas that now fall under the umbrella category of DePIN.
Mm. And that's a wonderful answer, by the way, and it's exactly the way that I got into DePIN as well. But the main sort of takeaway that I take from that answer is it does, within the crypto space and within the sort of Web3 space, it definitely opens up the next sort of billion users or the next billion sort of AI agents. The accessibility is the highest out of any other Web3 segment, I would say, because people can use it with a browser extension or downloading an app, or it can be embedded onto chips within devices like physical devices. So the barrier to entry, as you said, like Ethereum just being out there won't impact people's lives. But when say you can provide wireless internet access to a village, or you can provide, I don't know, decentralized energy at a cheaper price, this is all stuff that can impact real people. That's what really got me into it, and also the income generation for developing nations as well is like they can use excess resources that they have, whether that's mobile phones or whatever it is, and that could be a very good income generator for them. And they're providing a good, and these are goods that they're sort of taking away from huge trillion-dollar corporations that have power. So it's giving far more. And before that, they were very, very difficult to compete with. These guys, almost impossible to compete with. DePIN gives ability to combat these monopolies.
Absolutely. The way that I know we articulated this a bit in State of DePIN, but the way we think about it from first principles is like what kind of assets do humans have that they can go and contribute to networks together? We can have financial capital. It's mainly what crypto has been focused on so far. You can have physical capital like strength. You can have intelligence, your labor, your reputation, and of those, financial capital is by far the most like powerful outcome, right? With even all of us in developed market or in developed markets, like we're the top decile of the world in terms of wealth, and these are the people that are involved in crypto today. The rest of all those other aspects are not that way, right? We have the same 24 hours as everybody else. We have roughly the same normally distributed strength as people on other continents, the same intelligence, and so assuming that we can create truly permissionless networks where everyone can contribute and get paid for the real value of what they're bringing. We say the first billion people like bought their crypto, the next or first 500 million people maybe bought their crypto, the first few billion people will earn it. And I think we're really going to start to see that play out here in the next few years of DePIN.
So EV3 now, do you guys only invest in DePIN companies, or is it more sort of agnostic? And if so, what was the sort of thinking there?
Our North Star is, again, expanding the aperture of the crypto economy. And I'd say we're a small team and we're pretty low velocity in when we find a new insight. And when we do think we find a new insight, we spend a lot of time trying to polish that insight and talking to founders who know more about that space than us and trying to understand how these industry dynamics might change. I'd say we've had 2.5 maybe insights in the past 3 years of doing EV3. Over 2021 and 2022, it was primarily around DePIN. It was this idea that you could bootstrap physical infrastructure and coordinate physical infrastructure using on-chain incentives. And that led to us investing in companies that were doing wireless, companies that were doing energy, companies that were doing 3D printing to disrupt manufacturing and other sort of like capital-intensive heavy industries. In really late 2023 and 2024, we, thanks to an entrepreneur named Hirsch, who runs a company called Opacity Network, got us really killed by this idea, a technology he calls ZK-TLS, which is, you can think of as basically a totally generalizable version of Plaid. What Plaid did was make it so that any developer could access data from financial institutions that they could have a high degree of confidence was correct. Opacity is able to do this in a trustless way using zero-knowledge technology, in a way that is generalizable not just to banks, but to any Web2 sort of like server. And what that means is that these Web2 marketplaces if you think of DoorDash, if you think of Uber, if you think of Airbnb, like they don't own any homes, they don't own any cars. It's basically a website, a user interface, and it's a reputation graph where they keep track of how likely are these people to defraud the network, and can you kick off the users and drivers that are bad. And what opacity enables is basically now the reputation graph is no longer proprietary. Like this was really the only moat that was holding together all these businesses, because again, they don't have any physical assets. They don't really have regulatory capture. They have somewhat of a user base, but these things are a lot of people have user bases in the economy today. And so our second insight was this, that you could bootstrap digital marketplaces using Web2 reputation for the first time. And we invested in companies that were doing like food delivery, and companies that were doing like vacation rentals, like Airbnb, companies that were doing like financing products like earned wage access, and giving payroll loans based on verifying people's reputation. Um, and so that was our second insight. And what we've been really obsessed by the past, I'd say like 6 months, has been understanding how the AI is going to understand the physical world. When us humans go online when we visit a digital domain, we need a domain name, right? We need a website URL to go to. And when machines come to the physical world, or avatars or AR bots, like they're also going to need a domain to come to the physical world. And so how do you build this domain name addressing system whereby like agents are able to like gain awareness, or AIs are able to gain awareness of where they are in the world and interact with it, is something that's critical for AR and VR applications. It's critical for robotics. It's critical for drones. Um, there's a ton of use cases that are extremely labor intensive in the world today. Like, we chat with entrepreneurs who have like building inspection companies, and they get paid like, if you want to do a building, you need to inspect the building like every 10 years, depending on your jurisdiction. You literally have to like build scaffolding on the side of the buildings, climb up. It costs like $100,000 for a building inspection. It's extremely expensive. And they're thinking, okay, well, if I had a drone that had awareness of where it flew in the city, it could fly between skyscrapers, it could have an awareness of the age of these buildings, and we could like imbue that intelligence into an AI inside a drone. We can completely collapse the margin for this industry. And so we've been really, really focused on. Actually, just today, we're recording on February 19th. We announced an investment in a company called Over the Reality, that's working on similar types of physical AI, spatial computation. And we've made a couple of other investments in the space as well. And so we think this is going to be a really, really big and important, one of the most important categories of DePIN.
It's a fairly big answer that you had there, Sal. So I want to sort of break it down. And I want to go back to AI and DePIN. I think that's maybe a really relevant conversation at the moment. But my first question, taking a step back, is what industry dynamics are required for, as in, given how open-ended DePIN can be, it could be energy, it could be food delivery, as you said, there's a lot of different aspects to it. What industry dynamics are required for a DePIN to thrive?
We think about it in terms of what I mentioned earlier, which is like that there's this combination of hardware costs, and then there's coordination costs. And all costs associated with running a network in our minds can be bucketed into what these two mutually exclusive and bucketly exhaustive buckets. And when the things that DePINs are good for are the cases where the actual hardware, even if you bring down the prices very, very low to the cost of hardware, it still makes sense economically. And so if you say, and that means that the hardware has to have a true network effect. Like, if one person coming onto the network does not create more value for everybody else on the network and the nodes, then truly the DePIN does not benefit from the same flywheels as other industries. But I'd say it's really hard to tell, frankly, at early stage. And we've had our minds changed on this a number of times. And usually when we think that, when we try to box DePIN in, we end up getting proved wrong. So we've learned over time to have a little bit more of an open mind, even when we don't exactly see how it might play out. To give you an example of something that I think is like we think of as will be eventually a DePIN, but I think most people would say it's not. It's like we backed a company called Prophetic AI based in New York City, where the idea is they're building a headset that they hypothesize they can use electromagnetic stimulation to induce lucid dreaming, like on command. Basically, you can wear this headset at night. You're going to click a button on an app. And now when you sleep, it'll analyze your brain waves. It'll give you some sort of electromagnetic signal, and that will induce you to realize, like, oh shit, I'm actually dreaming, and I can now control my dream. And if you can control your dream, now you can actually, like, you can talk back. This thing can both read and write to your brainwaves. And so you basically have an IP connection straight into your brain while you're sleeping. And so they imagine a world where people are, like, working while they're sleeping with each other, working with each other while they're sleeping. I mean, and doing other stuff. And so this is something that, that it's an extremely ambitious project. Like, you have to, one, it's not entirely clear today that you can even induce lucid dreaming with electromagnetic signals. Two, it's not exactly clear that you can build a headset that's comfortable enough at a price point that makes sense that people will actually wear every day at night. Um, and three, it's not clear, like, how the network, how a token might incentivize all of this and play a central part in the ecosystem. But we think that it makes sense as a network economy, right? If you have a network of connected brains of people, like, this is truly a computing network. It's just a very different interface for how to interact with it. And so we bucket this as DePIN, even though they're years away, if not half a decade, from launching a token. We think these things they want to be networks by nature.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question, because it is a difficult one to define, and it's also difficult to. It's one of these things where, when you look at the industry, maybe you have to think creatively in terms of how a DePIN would actually fit into it sometimes. And one thing I always think about is, and I guess, like, the challenge for DePIN and the sort of pushback is, why can't this be done in a centralized way? So you mentioned a few examples of Uber, DoorDash, Airbnb. Many people say the definition of DePIN is utilizing spare resource, and it's a supply side sort of efficiency allocation problem, where you've got spare resource here, so there's another demand here, but they can't meet very well, and that's basically what Uber and Airbnb do. But Airbnb, as an example, you've got a spare room or whatever, or a spare like, to rent out your house. You rent it out to someone on the other side of the world. They come over, they stay in it for a few days. The two people don't even need to meet, right? Now, my question to you is, what does the decentralized aspect add to it, in terms of maybe the end user, who, at the end of the day, we know that decentralization is always the one thing that's always being challenged by sort of the next billion users, is, do we actually need that?
Yeah, it depends on the industry, but I think when you truly understand the fundamental economics of these businesses, you see that actually the coordination costs are what is ripping them apart, or at least that is fundamentally changing them from adapting to, like, the reality of what customers want. So, to go back to the DY example, which I think is easy for people to understand, it's not that telcos haven't tried to put small radios, like, in very densely in cities, like they have. It's just, it's impossible with the zoning. They can't make the economics work on getting people to, like, knock on doors and get permission and go in and install these things. And when they have tried it, the returns on capital have been so low that an activist investor comes in and says, like, hey, you guys need to stop doing this, because you obviously, like, it is not working. The economics are fundamentally broken. And so we've seen this repeated ways when companies try to build edge, especially on the physical, like, if they have some physical component and they try to build edge networks, it becomes extremely hard because the coordination costs are just too high. On things like food delivery, it's a similar dynamic, but because you don't have physical assets, the way I would explain it is that, you basically have these local economies that are the same drivers, the same restaurants, the same users. And eventually, at first, the mothership, like DoorDash or Uber, injects a bunch of subsidies into it. And then over time, as they take market share, they start taking a 30, 40% rate on the economics that goes through this platform back. And that doesn't really get reinvested back into any of these local community users. And so the reason why the food delivery business is so competitive is really driver churn. Like, these businesses spend a massive amount of money on acquiring and retaining their drivers so that they can go, and also users, but on the driver side, it's, like, more acute. So they can keep providing that service. And the way you can think about it is that if you're, like, driving and you're in London, if you're driving, like, I know you don't, or I don't know what's called ride sharing apps y'all have out there, but if you're driving Uber in London,
Bolt.
okay, yeah, so you're driving Uber in London, and you switch, like, it's not that you're going to be now, you're not going to go drive like Bolt in like Munich or something, right? You're going to drive like in the same city, you're going to drive the same people. It's just that there's going to be like a $50 advertising cost and transfer and admin cost for you to switch from Uber to Bolt so that maybe you can get a slightly higher rate. And what DePIN, what these food delivery, Nosh is the company we invested at, this decentralized food delivery does, is basically say, look, the restaurants already have uh, relationships with the drivers. They know who the best drivers are, and they don't need to turn again. Like it doesn't matter if it's Uber or Bolt. Like it's the same restaurant delivering the same food to the same customers. And so by pushing the responsibility of having driver relationships onto the restaurants themselves, you're actually able to eliminate this massive cost from the supply, from like basically the take that Uber has to rip out of these local economies, and keep it within the economy. Then it gets reinvested and grows with them. Um, and so, yeah, I think when you can use coordination in some way in order to just lower the way that supply side gets organized in these networks, that's usually when you can go and dramatically drop the costs to customers in a way that's meaningful enough for them to get them to switch over.
Do you see any industries now that you're looking at as an investing point of view, and you're seeing, because you guys don't, obviously you deploy capital, but you don't build directly yourselves, and do you look at any industries right now where you think this industry will be ripe for DePIN?
Any new one, any ones that aren't popularly, for us, like I think wireless and energy are the
Or
two.
maybe
Like,
maybe segments that are maybe there's not enough attention being built on those, because I know in the Mazari report you did like maybe five different verticals of industries that DePIN is in, something like that, and I think wireless was number one. But are there any industries that you think DePIN will be amazing, it would be perfect for this, or secondly, there's not enough attention on those existing industries?
going back to the pattern that I mentioned, where you have these like rock bottom actual physical hardware costs and the coordination costs are very high. Like we look for that. That's basically our north star, and we look for that pattern everywhere. And like what industries exhibit that behavior today? One that definitely does is 3D printing, which I think not that many people are thinking about manufacturing, but additive manufacturing now, like there is no, there have been up in the past, like, various like trend or hype waves of 3D printing. That's certainly not the case now. Like 3D printing has extremely sustained, like if you're prototyping, um, if you're printing things on demand, like it's obviously 3D printing is the right use case for a certain number of manufacturing use cases, and probably will continue, that share will continue to grow. So we invest in a company called 3DOS or 3DOS, which the
Yeah, we
founder,
had them on a few episodes ago.
oh amazing, yeah, the founder John like started one of the a 3D printing business, 3D printing operating system back like, I don't know, maybe a decade ago or something, or maybe even more than a decade ago. So he's been in the industry for a long time, and uh, he is that, they're now at the point where you can actually enable all types of, basically any e-commerce seller to go and 3D print products on the fly and deliver them to users in a way where they don't have to trust the manufacturer of that product. And from a very high level, like why we think this is important, when we think about the mega trend of small businesses moving online, think of like what actually constitutes a small business. For us, it's like, one, you have the storefront, like you need people to walk by and see it and go in. You have the cash register, you need to accept payments, and you have the back room where you actually make the stuff that you're selling. And what we've seen over the past like 10 years is that a company like Shopify went and said, look, you had your storefront, we're going to digitize the storefront for you in a very easy way. And they turned that into a $100 billion business. And Stripe said, hey, you have a cash register, let us do the digitized version of this cash register. And they also turned that into close, probably $100 billion business now. I think the last valuation may be a little bit lower, but I don't think you can put in money much lower than that today, just Stripe. And 3DOS, we think, will be the third leg. They're going to be this digitized manufacturing layer, whereby if you're any e-commerce seller, any brand, any, like, you just need prototypes for any type of physical product, you go to 3DOS, and they've completely digitized this experience for you.
Yeah, we had them on the podcast. Very impressive, and honestly, it's been the only 3D printing DePIN, not only that we've had on the podcast, but that I've seen. I haven't seen any other players. So yeah, it's not being built heavy in that segment of things. I want to move on to the report that you guys wrote that was released, was it January 2024 2025, sorry, for the 2024 Mazari reports. So we talked very briefly around those different segments of where the DePIN sort of activity is clustered and focused on. I guess for people that haven't read the reports, what are the sort of key takeaways that you guys sort of wrote, and what was the most sort of salient for you? What really stood out?
I think the key message, for us, it's a big exercise in sort of like looking back on the last year's report and seeing the amazing growth of DePIN every year. And I think the key message people could take away is to understand where in the like cycle or progression of DePIN are, like what maturity level, what inning are we in DePIN? And the answer is that like in 20 previously the question was about supply, and these playbooks have been figured out by this point. They're it's not to say it's trivial, and it's not to say it can work for every single application, but if you're determined and creative enough, like you can scale a supply side of a DPIN to a meaningful scale of almost any type of device. Obviously not like GPS satellites or something that costs millions of dollars, but like within a reasonable time frame, you can build supply side. And we've seen many different iterations of experimentation, and every time we see that the incentives are just are too powerful of a driver for people's behavior, and they'll build almost anything if you design it in the right way. The stage where we're at now, and sorry, just to double down on that, like in the phase when supply was important, the kind of metrics that investors in the market would focus on are number of nodes, right? We used to talk about like Helium's like value at like X dollars per node, and
Mhm.
or like the community's invested this many dollars of hardware, and like that's how it compares to the market cap. And that worked for a while until it didn't, until we realized that like, okay, not every dollar of hardware, just because you spend a dollar on hardware doesn't mean that it's worth a dollar, doesn't mean it can produce a dollar of revenues, doesn't it's a very gameable metric. And we're at the phase of the market now where several DPINs have proved that they can generate revenues at scale. So it's not just enough to have supply anymore. People are generating real demand with these networks, and they're getting usage, and they're putting those revenues on chain and creating these circular flywheels of buybacks with their token. Um, and so I think the phase of the market where we are now is like you can imagine a Series A or B startup. It's like it's all about revenue growth. Um, and if you don't have that revenue, it's very hard to stick out. If you do have that revenue, people are very anchored to using that as a metric for like how much the network is working or not, much more so than nodes. Now people don't want to focus on that anymore. And I think this will last through 2025 and likely 2026 as a couple of protocols start to hit like what we true escape velocity, meaning like 10 or tens of millions of dollars of annualized revenues. At that point, a dollar of revenue is not a dollar of revenue. Like you have to understand the unit economics of those protocols. And I think this will be a 2026 and 2027 event. Um, but what we're, as an early stage investor, so we think about this a lot, you have to be ahead of the curve. And so we think about what DPINs are going to be very valuable and be seen as like the most pristine networks of tomorrow through or multiple years forward. And those are the networks that are not just generating revenues, but are generating revenues that are highly profitable, where they can undercut the existing Web2 competitors and still earn a healthy profit and reinvest that into growing their networks even more and create a flywheel. Um, and so there are some categories of DPINs that we think can be much more profitable long term because they just can do a lot more types of things for customers. Like your Wi-Fi router is an extremely versatile device. Like how many different use cases have you used the internet for over the past 24 hours alone? Same with energy. When you start to get into more niche types of sensors, like when you say I had a pitch yesterday for a DePIN, a company that's building underwater. It's like a drone, underwater unmanned vehicles that they use to scan for pipeline, like bursts in like underwater transatlantic cables or for pipeline oil and gas pipelines. And these things they're very good for a very specific use case, but they don't have the ability to tack on 5, 10, dozens of different use cases, which means that they are less, I think, attractive from a unit economics perspective than revenues in really big markets. So anyway, just to go back to your question, which was, what's the key takeaway? It's that supply side is a solved playbook at this point. We can scale supply for these networks. The question is, can you scale supply in a way that you can find usable customers for this and scale revenue quickly? And then is that revenue profitable or not? And can you reinvest back into the network to keep growing? I think the networks that answer yes to all those questions will be, will be worth tens of billions of dollars. the networks that get stuck in the middle may be worth several hundred millions of dollars or $1 billion at best, but will be, they're not going to be like they're not going to be comparable to like layer ones of today from a market cap and sheer like importance perspective.
Mm. So that was 2024 and sort of early 2025. But one of the points you just mentioned was sort of the evolution of DePINs going towards more sort of revenue generating, profit generating. And would you say one of the key things here is where for a DePIN is how many use cases does that business basically achieve? Because as you mentioned, the sort of underwater drone is very good for a specific use case, but say a wireless router can do multiple different things, or say a GPU for someone's laptop can do a lot of different things. So yeah, where do you see it evolving across this year and also next year?
That's frankly exactly how we think about it. I think people will go and study the other markets and try to use the same framework once they also realize it. For example, they'll look at manufacturing and say, "Wow, there's actually a lot of different use cases for what you can might manufacture an arbitrary like plastic item for, or not even just plastic. You can use other materials as well." The Just to illustrate this by example, like one of the reasons that one of the ways that we learned this lesson the hard way was with mapping networks. We've been, like networks like HiveMapper and Nadix have been around for a number of years now, and we've known those founders. And I was always very skeptical of, or I was previously was very skeptical of mapping as a use case because I didn't fully understand how extensible it was. And how many different use cases to be built on top. And the way I realized this was actually I had, both Mahesh and I we worked at investment banks before, and we have a lot of friends who are institutional investors today. And there's this industry called driving for dollars, where investors bid on homes that may be foreclosed, and if they get to them first, they can potentially get a better deal, and they can go and resell those, buy the bank from the dead, or like resell them or fix them up, and sell them at a less distressed price. And so there's this industry of people basically will go and search for homes that look foreclosed and sell those leads to private equity firms, and it's a surprisingly big industry. And he worked at one of the firms that would buy these homes and like repackage them. And when I told him about HiveMapper, he's an investor in our fund. He literally, like within 3 months, he had quit his job, and he was just using HiveMapper to like set locations to try to incentivize people to go and drive around neighborhoods, using some very, very rudimentary AI to scan like which ones hadn't mowed their lawn for like 3 weeks, and using that as a signal to find triggers to go and create a lead list to sell to private equity firms, which he then spun off and built as a business himself. And is now like pseudo kind of retired. It's not that intensive of a business to run. And so as I saw that, I was like, okay, really what HiveMapper and Nadix and other networks like it and the mapping networks have created is the ability for you to have eyes in any arbitrary location in the world, like on demand. And how many use cases does that enable? Like, so many use cases. And when you bring AI into it and you understand these machines and robots and avatars are going to need an understanding of the world around them, and they're going to get that through cameras as well, the use cases just become even more exponential. So we're very, very excited about, it's an extremely tough challenge because sensors or cameras are delicate sensors, and they capture a lot of data, and the processing is expensive, and it's a very highly non-trivial engineering challenge. But we think the mapping networks are attacking this huge industry that the market hasn't appreciated yet. So yeah, you're spot on though on how we think about just like how many use cases could this network enable for new developers, because you can get the old use cases on board. Like we see we see the telcos offloading onto Helium, but things take time. Like they happen, but they take a lot of fucking time. Like we've been talking about this for years for Helium, right? And like it happened within the past like 8 or 9 months. So I think we get more excited about what type of net new use cases can DePINs enable compared to just lowering costs for existing uses.
Yeah, because there's different aspects of DePIN where, as you say, like it seems more foundational. So like the mapping of location seems more foundational, but then you have more sort of like AI. We'll talk about AI in a second, actually, but AI computes where they're NVIDIA chips are in short supply, and you sort of having this whole sort of army of H100 chips around the world. You can definitely, it's a supply side problem, right? So like that makes sense, and it's definitely more mature, which is why like Aether and Akash and all these sort of guys, and Nosana, they're becoming sort of fairly big as a result. Um, so yeah, let's talk about AI for a second. How does AI and DePIN sort of marry up? How does that sort of relationship how does that relationship work? I have to talk about AI in terms of it's just it's the hot topic. I feel like it's taken over Web3 entirely, really, with the AI agents. So where does it sort of fit in?
Yeah, the way we think about it is this: it's two ways. Like there's DePIN on both edges of AI, and AI is sort of in the middle. What I mean by that is DePIN creates the ingredients for AI: compute, bandwidth, energy, like all the things that artificial intelligence needs to be created and to generate itself. Are the core digital commodities that DePINs create. And so this is a credit to an entrepreneur named Nils, who runs a company called Aoki, who is another one who we've invested in, has really helped pull us on this idea of spatial computing. But he has this framing that DePIN is AI reaching back in time to build the resources it needs to sustain itself. Because AI will, again, need massive amounts of these resources. And empirically today, humanity is not able to coordinate them in a way that's useful for this, except in a really centralized way where the AI presumably loses control. Um, and so when we think that actually the primary, and we already see evidence of this in our portfolio companies and also outside of it in the space, that the buyers of the data and the commodities that DePINs create are primarily AI companies. Um, and then, so this is the sort of like pre AI DePIN. There's also like the post AI DePIN, which is like actually DePINs that are incentivizing intelligence themselves, or creating some sort of consensus mechanism that tries to measure the value of intelligence, and using that as a carrot to get AI and AI infrastructure to optimize to continuously get closer and closer to the most optimal or most valuable sort of like setup. And these are networks like BitTensor and others where they don't implicitly you don't implicitly need to, or explicitly need to, um, provide compute or GPUs. It really is just an arbitrary incentivization mechanism for the most useful and powerful intelligence. And of course, we think the most useful and powerful intelligences, individual intelligences, are going to be artificial ones. And so naturally, it is a network that incentivizes these different artificial intelligences to compete and cooperate with one another. And so that's how we see the bridging. It is the ingredients, and it's also the sort of like output and carrot that will drive AI towards increasingly more valuable outcomes that a community can control, not just one company.
Super interesting. I want to ask you a final question before we start wrapping up the podcast, Sal. It's been such a pleasure having you on. And the last question is, you talked about sort of deep in within the next sort of, this year and next year, more of a looking forward question. And you just obviously talked about AI. What does it look like in 10 years time?
I think in 5, 10 years time, I don't think the term deep in will still be around. First of all, I think like we'll just have, it'll be the default way that infrastructure was built. Um, and so I think deep in is sort of like frankly, the term itself, not the category of the industry, but the term itself is sort of like in the sixth, seventh, in its like late innings. It feels like it has lost some of its utility as an umbrella category. Um, because the dynamics of these different types of projects are very different. And so what I imagine is that, the term DePIN sort of like fades into the background. But what we consider DePIN today goes on to grow 100x over the next 5 years. And we see a couple of networks that become absolutely dominant in their industries. Maybe it's a wireless network, maybe an energy network, or I think maybe those take a little bit longer. It could be a newer industry like mapping or robotics that DePIN really takes over first. Um, but I think we have at least one clear example of an industry where the winner by just sheer scale and size and revenues and market cap is a DePIN. And once that switch flips in people's minds, like people realize that, okay, they'll extrapolate to all the other industries that, industries that are much, much bigger. Um, and as these networks get bigger, they get more powerful. It's the nature of a flywheel. The incentives are greater. The number of the pool of talent that's willing to come and get involved in these networks is higher quality and is always raising and becoming more competitive. So we think we're very, very early in deep in the space and the trend, kind of late in deep in the term, would be how I describe it.
And I agree. I think even now the term is diluting to the extent where it just doesn't seem right to even give people the name DePIN or not give people the name, because it seems a bit diluted now. You've got like edge AI networks, you've got like there's a lot of different stuff going on where it feels like they should even be their own categories, you know? So yeah, I completely agree with that. Now, yeah, we're getting to the end of the podcast, Sal. So thank you so much for coming on. One question I like to ask all my guests when we're wrapping up the podcast is, what is your favorite use case of DePIN? What outside of what you're immediately doing? But of course, you're not a builder yourself. So yeah, what is your favorite use case of DePIN?
I I'll try not to reveal too much because I don't want to out. And we recently invested in a company doing something similar to this that I'm super excited about. But one of the reason I got into crypto in the first place, so I was like a super nerdy computer kid and like buying used computers and desktops at garages and setting up miners for or some of the early computing networks in my room. And I was obsessed with aliens, so my favorite one was SETI at Home, which is basically a screensaver where you could. They had this telescope out it's actually in Puerto Rico, not too far from me, but like a 1 acre, huge telescope that would capture all sorts of like microwave radio signals from space, and they would basically search through this for signs of prime numbers or other signals that would indicate that we have some intelligent life trying to send us signals. Because obviously you can't build a server farm in the middle of the like jungle in Puerto Rico, especially not in like the early 2000s when this came out. And millions of people downloaded this. Like I had several computers in my room running SETI at Home miners back in the day. I remember, and this eventually got me into running other types of nodes. There was folding at home, just doing the same thing for sequencing the human genome before that had been accomplished, and then eventually into running Bitcoin nodes. And so the idea of crowdsourcing signals of signs of extraterrestrial intelligence has always been super dear to my heart, because it was the reason that I got into crypto, and I think is one of the most, if you consider, I think crypto is good for making markets and sort of like information signals. And that is one of the most powerful information, like think about MEV, right? Crypto's like, there's this now narrative around the value of blockchains coming from MEV, which basically means like how much economic values can be reorganized by the information that this chain produces. And take the question for alien, like if we knew that aliens were here tomorrow, like how much economic reorganization would there be around the earth? Like it would be absolutely massive. And so we think that is actually, or I think it's a really powerful signal. But anyways, we have a company that we backed recently with a extremely talented astronomer who actually used to work at the SETI Institute, or works still at the SETI Institute for many years. And in his prior company, designed one of the like nicest consumer grade telescopes. Like if you're like an amateur astronomy nerd and you had one of it's like the Apple of telescopes. Basically, it has an app. It's nicely controlled. It's sleek. You leave it outside and it like automatically will like find interesting space events for you. And so he's turning this into a DePIN, where the idea is to use optical telescopes on Earth to create space and satellite observation data. And so the immediate use case for this is satellite operators need to pay to basically triangulate the position of their satellite in order to like, one, report it to the space agencies, and two, to like not crash into each other, because then they get really big fines. And so these observations, you can basically do this with a telescope, meaning like a camera pointed at the sky that zooms in and takes pictures, or you can do this with the radar, meaning like a radio signal that shoots up at satellites, bounces back, and you can read the Doppler shift and the time it takes to sort of like triangulate the location. And these things are quite expensive, super expensive today. I mean, like the companies that offer it can only run 5 or 6 locations around the world because these telescopes are super hard to operate. And think about it, if you have 5 or 6 telescopes around the world, well, half of them are going to be on a side of Earth where it's daytime, so they're useless. So now you're down to 2 or 3 at any given point in time. If you have 2 or 3 satellites at a given point in time, a satellite may only go over a lower orbit. Satellites go around the Earth like 15 times a day because they have to circulate really fast to not leave orbit. And so you may only see a satellite once, or like you may only catch it once or twice a day or a week, and so it's very unreliable. But if you had thousands of these telescopes, you basically are able to get real time information as to what is happening up in space. And going back to our conversation on AI and mapping, it's like we think that when AIs are able to ingest all this data, one of the most natural things that it'll be interested in is what's going on in space. Because I think it's one of the most, in some ways, it's more existential for AIs than it is for humans, right? Like if there's aliens, like humans will be maybe arguably like living in caves and rediscovering fire, like while AI is long gone or something in some catastrophic event. So we imagine that sufficiently motivated to survive for survival AI will be really, really interested in this data. Um, and so, yeah, it's weird. It's out there, but something that's really close to my heart and has both immediate value today, and also we think a lot produces some extremely interesting data set for future the industry and academics and researchers, etc.
That's insane. Wow. That's the most unique answer I've got from that question. So thank you so much for that, Sal. That was really, really profound. Um, yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man. It's been such a pleasure having you on. And a bit of a full circle moment, obviously, with you coming to our event in Dubai before the launch of the podcast. So how can people stay in touch with you and EV3 going forward?
Yeah, our website is ev3.xyz. And if you're a founder or you're working in some infrastructure company and thinking about being a founder, you can email us at escapevelocity@ev3.xyz. And we'd love to chat and see if we can help your project.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sal, for coming on again. And I'm sure I'll catch you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion, brought to you by Minima, the real-world blockchain. The only layer 1 blockchain lean and compact enough to run in full on any mobile or IoT device. If you're new to DePIN, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter to stay up to date. Thank you so much again. We'll catch you in the next episode.